A scream cut through the evening air, and Clara Bennett froze in the middle of the crosswalk, her heart slamming against her ribs. An old woman stood in the center of the busy road, cars honking, headlights flashing, drivers shouting out their windows. She was thin and fragile, dressed in a long gray coat, clutching her chest and turning in circles as if she had no idea where she was. Her silver hair was tangled by the wind, and her eyes were wide with a fear that made Clara's stomach twist. Nobody moved to help her. People on the sidewalk lifted their phones instead of their hands, capturing the moment instead of stopping it. A truck driver blared his horn so loudly that the old woman flinched and stumbled backward, nearly falling into the path of an oncoming car. Clara did not think. She ran. She sprinted across the crosswalk, ignoring the red light, ignoring the driver who cursed at her through his open window, and reached the old woman just as her knees buckled. Clara caught her under the arms before she hit the pavement, holding her upright with a strength she did not know she had. "I've got you," Clara said, her voice steady, even though her pulse was racing. "I've got you. You're safe now." The old woman's eyes locked onto hers, glassy and unfocused, but something in them sharpened for a moment, as if she were trying to memorize Clara's face. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Clara guided her to the sidewalk, away from the danger, and knelt beside her on the cold concrete. A small crowd had gathered now that the danger had passed, murmuring, filming, doing nothing useful at all. "Someone call an ambulance," Clara said sharply, and a young man finally lowered his phone and dialed. "I don't need an ambulance," the old woman whispered, gripping Clara's wrist with surprising force. "I need to get home. Please, they will be looking for me." "Who will be looking for you?" The woman shook her head, refusing to answer, her fingers trembling against Clara's skin. Up close, Clara could see the fine quality of her coat, the pearl earrings, the gold ring on her finger shaped like a small crest. This was not a woman who wandered the streets by accident. Something had happened to her. Something had frightened her badly enough that she had run into traffic without seeing it at all. "Okay," Clara said gently. "No ambulance. But I'm not leaving you alone. Do you know your address?" The woman blinked slowly, as if pulling the information up from somewhere deep and foggy. She recited a street name that Clara recognized immediately, and her stomach dropped. It was the wealthiest part of the city, a neighborhood of iron gates and private security, a place Clara had only ever walked past and never through. She worked double shifts at a diner 3 miles from there, counting coins for bus fare and stretching every paycheck until it screamed. "That's a long way from here," Clara said carefully. "How did you end up all the way out here?" "I don't remember," the woman admitted, and for the first time, real panic crept into her voice. "I don't remember leaving the house. I don't remember walking. I just remember being so afraid, and then I was standing in the middle of the road, and the cars were coming, and I couldn't move my legs." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. This sounded like more than confusion. It sounded like something had been done to her, or something inside her mind had simply broken loose, and either possibility was frightening. "What's your name?" Clara asked. "Elena. I'm Clara. I'm going to help you get home, Elena. Can you stand?" With Clara's support, Elena rose unsteadily to her feet. The small crowd had already lost interest and dispersed, moving on with their evenings as though nothing had happened at all. Clara flagged down a taxi, helped Elena into the back seat, and gave the driver the address Elena had recited. The driver's eyebrows lifted slightly at the name of the street, but he said nothing and pulled away from the curb. The ride was quiet. Elena stared out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. Clara studied her from the corner of her eye, noticing the way Elena kept glancing at the side mirror, as if she expected someone to be following them. "Is there someone I should call?" Clara asked. "Family? A caretaker?" "No," Elena said quickly. Too quickly. "No calls? Not yet. Elena, if something happened to you, if someone hurt you or scared you, you can tell me. I want to help." Elena turned to look at her then, and there was something in her expression that Clara could not quite read. Gratitude, yes, but also a strange kind of sorrow, as if she already knew that helping her would cost Clara more than she understood. "You have a kind face," Elena said softly. "A kind heart. That is rare in this city, rarer than you know. I just did what anyone would do." "No," Elena said, shaking her head slowly. "You did what almost no one would do. Everyone else filmed. You ran." The taxi turned onto a wide street, lined with tall trees and high stone walls, and Clara's nerves sharpened with every passing block. The houses grew larger, the gates grew taller, and finally the taxi slowed in front of an iron gate flanked by 2 stone pillars. Cameras were mounted on either side, small red lights blinking steadily. "This is it," Elena said. Clara paid the driver with money she could not really spare and helped Elena out of the car. Before she could even reach for the intercom at the gate, it buzzed open on its own, as though someone inside had been watching the entire time. A long driveway stretched ahead, lined with manicured hedges, leading to a mansion so large that Clara nearly lost her breath looking at it. Stone columns framed the entrance. Warm light spilled from tall windows. It looked like something out of a film, not a place where an ordinary old woman would live alone. "Elena," Clara said carefully, "whose house is this?" Before Elena could answer, the front door opened, and 2 men stepped out onto the porch, moving with the kind of controlled urgency that made Clara's instincts scream at her to run. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces tense, their eyes scanning the driveway with practiced precision. "Mrs. Russo," one of them said, rushing forward, his relief evident even from a distance. "Thank God. We have been searching everywhere." Mrs. Russo, not Elena Vasquez, not a lonely widow who had wandered off by accident. Mrs. Russo. So Clara's mind raced, trying to place the name, and a cold unease settled over her, though she could not yet say why. The man reached them and immediately took Elena's arm, guiding her gently toward the house, murmuring apologies and reassurances. The second man remained near Clara, his gaze sweeping over her with sharp, assessing eyes, as if he were cataloging every detail of her appearance for a report he would give to someone else. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone polite but edged with suspicion. "Clara, I found her wandering near the highway. She almost got hit by a car." The man's expression flickered, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You brought her here yourself?" "She asked me to. I wasn't going to leave her alone." He studied her for a long moment, and Clara felt very small standing on that grand driveway in her worn sneakers and diner uniform, still smelling faintly of coffee and fried onions from her shift. "Wait here," he said finally, and disappeared into the house after Elena. Clara stood alone on the driveway, unsure whether to leave or stay, her heart still pounding from the chaos of the last hour. She glanced around at the grounds, the fountain in the distance, the security cameras mounted discreetly along the walls, and felt, for the first time, a prickling sense that she had stumbled into something far bigger than a simple act of kindness. Minutes passed. The night grew colder. Clara wrapped her arms around herself and considered calling a taxi to take her home, telling herself that her part in this story was already finished, that Elena was safe now, and that was all that mattered. Then she heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from inside the house, growing louder with each step. The front door opened wider, and a man stepped out onto the porch, filling the doorway with a presence so commanding that the air itself seemed to shift around him. He was tall, dressed in a dark tailored suit despite the late hour, his jaw set, his eyes dark and unreadable. He moved down the steps with the calm, controlled walk of someone who had never once in his life been unsure of himself, and every person around him seemed to straighten at his arrival, as though his presence alone demanded it. He stopped a few feet from Clara, studying her the way a man studies something he does not yet understand and does not trust. "You're the one who helped my grandmother," he said. It was not a question. Clara's mouth went dry. "Yes." His eyes moved over her slowly, taking in every detail, and Clara had the strange, unsettling feeling that she was being measured against some invisible standard, judged for a purpose she could not guess. "My name is Dominic Russo," he said, "and I don't know yet whether I should thank you or ask you exactly why a stranger was so eager to bring her into my home." The way he said it, calm and quiet, was somehow far more frightening than if he had shouted, and Clara realized, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that helping Elena had pulled her into a world she knew nothing about, one where kindness could be mistaken for a threat, and where the wrong answer might matter more than she could possibly imagine. Clara stood frozen under Dominic Russo's stare, unable to find words that felt safe enough to say. Every instinct told her that this was not a man who accepted careless answers, and the silence between them stretched until it felt unbearable. "I told you already," she finally said. "I found her near the highway. She was confused, scared, almost hit by a car. I couldn't just walk away. Most people would have. I'm not most people." Something flickered across his face, so brief that Clara almost missed it. Not quite approval, but not suspicion either. He studied her a moment longer, then turned his head slightly toward the man standing near the door. "Vincent, bring her inside. My grandmother wants to see her again before she rests." Vincent, the man who had first approached them on the driveway, nodded once and gestured for Clara to follow. She hesitated, glancing at Dominic, who had already begun walking back toward the house without waiting to see if she obeyed. Clara followed, her sneakers silent on the polished stone steps, her mind spinning with questions she did not dare ask aloud. The inside of the house was even more overwhelming than the outside. High ceilings stretched above her, chandeliers glittering with soft golden light, art on the walls that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a private home. Everything gleamed, everything whispered of wealth, so old and so deep that Clara felt like an intruder simply by breathing the air inside. Vincent led her down a hallway lined with photographs, most of them formal, stiff, filled with men in suits standing beside each other with unreadable expressions. Only one photograph stood apart from the rest, smaller, tucked near the end of the hall. It showed a much younger Elena laughing beside a boy who could not have been older than 10, his smile wide and unguarded in a way Clara suspected he had long since forgotten how to wear. They reached a set of double doors, and Vincent knocked softly before pushing them open. Inside, Elena sat propped against a mountain of pillows in a large four-poster bed, a cup of tea steaming on the nightstand beside her. She looked smaller now, more fragile than she had on the street, but her eyes brightened the moment she saw Clara. "There you are," Elena said, her voice warm. "I was afraid they had sent you away without even a proper thank you. I wasn't going to leave without knowing you were okay." Elena patted the edge of the bed, and Clara approached cautiously, aware of Dominic standing near the doorway, arms crossed, watching the exchange with quiet intensity. "Sit, dear. You've had a long night because of me." Clara sat carefully at the edge of the bed. Up close, Elena's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea, and Clara noticed a faint bruise forming along her wrist, the kind that came from being gripped too tightly. Her stomach tightened with unease. "Elena, what happened to you tonight, before I found you?" The warmth in Elena's expression dimmed slightly. She glanced toward Dominic, some silent exchange passing between grandmother and grandson, before she looked back at Clara. "Well, I went for a walk," Elena said carefully. "I do that sometimes, when the house feels too quiet. I must have gotten turned around. You said someone would be looking for you. You said it like you were scared." "Clara," Dominic said from the doorway, his voice a quiet warning. Elena raised a hand gently, silencing him without even looking his way. "It's all right, Dominic. She helped me. She deserves honesty, even if it is only a little." She turned back to Clara, lowering her voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "There are people who do not wish this family well. I do not always remember things as clearly as I used to, but tonight, I remember being afraid before I even reached the street. I remember a car following me, slowing down beside me. a man watching from the window. I ran. I do not remember much after that, only the sound of horns, and then your voice telling me I was safe. Clara's blood ran cold. This was not confusion born from age. Someone had frightened Elena badly enough to send her running into traffic without any thought for her own safety. You should call the police, Clara said instinctively, then immediately felt foolish for saying it once she saw the look that passed between Vincent and Dominic. We handle our own matters, Dominic said flatly. Someone terrified an elderly woman into running into oncoming traffic, and you're going to handle it yourselves. Clara, Elena said gently, patting her hand, there are things about this family you do not yet understand. Things that are not easy to explain to someone from outside our world. Then explain them, Clara said, surprising herself with her own boldness. Because right now all I understand is that you were terrified, and this man is standing there acting like it's an inconvenience rather than something dangerous. Dominic's jaw tightened, and for a moment Clara feared she had gone too far, that she had spoken to a man used to obedience as though he were an ordinary stranger, deserving no fear at all. But instead of anger, something almost like respect passed briefly through his eyes. You have no idea who you're speaking to, he said quietly. No, Clara admitted, I don't. But I know an old woman was scared enough to run into traffic, and I know that matters more to me than whatever reputation you're worried about protecting. Elena laughed softly, a warm, delighted sound that seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. I like her, Dominic. She has spine. She has recklessness, Dominic corrected, though there was the faintest trace of something softer beneath his stern tone. Vincent cleared his throat from near the door. Sir, perhaps it would be wise to speak privately. Dominic nodded once, then looked back at Clara. Stay with my grandmother. I'll return shortly. He left the room with Vincent, their voices dropping low as soon as the door closed behind them, too quiet for Clara to make out the words, though the tension in them was unmistakable even through the wood. Elena sighed, sinking further into her pillows, some of the light fading from her expression now that her grandson was gone. He worries too much, Elena said quietly. He has carried this family on his shoulders since he was far too young to bear such weight. Sometimes I think he forgot how to simply be a person somewhere along the way. What happened to him? Elena's gaze grew distant, memories rising behind her eyes. His father died when Dominic was 17. Murdered, in this very house, in front of him. From that day forward, Dominic became someone else. Someone harder. Someone who trusts almost no one, because the people he trusted most were taken from him in the worst way imaginable. Clara's chest ached with an unexpected sympathy, one she had not expected to feel for a man who had greeted her with such cold suspicion only minutes earlier. That's terrible. It is, Elena agreed, and it is why I worry for him more than I worry for myself. Power protects a man's body, Clara, but it does very little for his heart. The door opened again, and Dominic returned alone, his expression unreadable, though something in his posture seemed slightly less guarded than before. It's late, he said. I'll have someone drive you home. That's not necessary. It is, he said firmly. The neighborhood where you found my grandmother and the neighborhood you live in are not the same. I won't have you walking those streets alone at this hour, not after tonight. Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, surprised by the genuine concern beneath his authoritative tone. Thank you, she said instead. Elena reached out and squeezed her hand one final time before she left the room. Come back and see me again, Clara. An old woman gets lonely in a house full of guards and grandsons who forget how to smile. I will, Clara promised, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. Vincent led her back through the grand hallway toward the front door, where a car already waited on the driveway, engine idling softly in the darkness. Dominic followed a few steps behind, his eyes fixed on Clara in a way that made her pulse quicken, for reasons she did not fully understand. Clara, he said, just before she reached the car. She turned back to face him. "Thank you," he said, the words clearly unfamiliar and difficult for him, as though gratitude were a language he rarely spoke. "For what you did tonight. Not many people would have stopped. She needed help, that's all it took. For you, maybe," Dominic said quietly. "For most people, it takes far more than that." Clara held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the cool night air, before she finally turned and climbed into the car. As the vehicle pulled away from the mansion, she glanced back through the rear window and saw Dominic still standing on the driveway, watching her leave, his expression unreadable in the dim porch light. She did not yet know that this single night of kindness had already marked her, in ways she could not begin to understand, as someone dangerous people would soon be watching very closely. A week passed before Clara heard from the Russo family again, and by the time the knock came at her apartment door, she had almost convinced herself the entire night had been some strange, unrepeatable moment that would never touch her ordinary life again. She opened the door to find Vincent standing in the hallway, dressed as impeccably as before, a small envelope in his hand. "Mrs. Russo would like you to visit," he said simply, "if you are willing." Clara glanced at the envelope, then back at Vincent's carefully neutral expression. "Is something wrong? Is she all right?" "She is well. She simply misses your company. She has asked for you every day since you left." Something warm bloomed in Clara's chest at that, unexpected, and a little embarrassing in its intensity. She had thought about Elena often that week, wondering if she was safe, wondering about the fear in her eyes that night, wondering too, though she was reluctant to admit it even to herself, about the tall, guarded man who had thanked her so stiffly on the driveway. "I can come now, if that works." Vincent nodded and gestured toward the car waiting at the curb below. The drive to the mansion felt different this time, less frightening, more familiar. When the gates opened and the grand house came into view, Clara felt something closer to anticipation than fear. Vincent led her not to Elena's bedroom this time, but to a bright sunroom at the back of the house, where Elena sat in a wicker chair surrounded by potted plants, sunlight spilling gently across her lap. "Clara," Elena's face lit up the moment she saw her, and she extended both hands in greeting. "I was beginning to think you had changed your mind about visiting an old woman." "Never," Clara said, taking the offered hands and settling into the chair beside her. "How have you been feeling?" "Better, now that you're here." This house grows very quiet when there is no one to talk to but guards and grandsons, too busy for conversation. They talked for over an hour, about small things at first: Clara's work at the diner, Elena's love of gardening, the plants that lined the sunroom, which Elena tended herself despite everyone insisting she allow the staff to do it instead. Slowly, the conversation deepened, and Clara found herself sharing pieces of her life she rarely spoke of: her parents who had passed years ago, the loneliness of building a life with no family left to lean on. "You understand loneliness," Elena said softly, studying her with new understanding. "That is why you stopped for me that night. You saw someone as alone as you sometimes feel." Clara had never thought of it that way, but the moment Elena said it, she recognized the truth in it, quiet and undeniable. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, and Clara looked up to see Dominic entering the sunroom, dressed more casually than she had seen him before, though his expression carried the same controlled intensity as always. He paused when he saw Clara, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "I didn't realize we had a guest." "I invited her," Elena said pointedly. "This is still my house, Dominic, regardless of how much you insist on running it like your own fortress." A faint, almost amused expression crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He nodded toward Clara. "Clara, Dominic." He lingered near the doorway for a moment, as though deciding whether to stay or leave, before finally crossing the room and taking a seat near his grandmother, his gaze occasionally drifting toward Clara in a way that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "How is the investigation going?" Elena asked him, her tone shifting, the warmth replaced by something sharper. Dominic's jaw tightened, slowly. Whoever frightened you that night was careful. No cameras caught a clear image of the car. No one has come forward with information." "You think it was Volkov?" Elena said, not quite a question. "I think it's the most likely possibility," Dominic replied carefully, his eyes flicking briefly toward Clara, as though weighing how much should be said in front of her. "Who is Volkov?" Clara asked, before she could stop herself. Silence settled over the room for a moment, heavy and deliberate. "A rival family," Dominic said finally. "There has been tension between us for years. My grandmother's incident may or may not be connected to that tension. It's still under investigation." "Tension," Clara repeated slowly. "Is that the polite word for it?" Something flickered in Dominic's expression, almost a smile, quickly suppressed. "You're very direct, for someone who works in a diner. I've found directness saves time. It also makes enemies." "So does silence, apparently." Elena laughed softly, delighted by the exchange, watching the two of them with an expression Clara could not quite place, something knowing, something hopeful. "She reminds me of your mother," Elena said quietly to Dominic. "Same fire. Same refusal to be quiet simply because a room expects it of her." Dominic's expression shifted subtly at the mention of his mother, something old and painful crossing behind his eyes before he masked it once more. Clara noticed but said nothing, sensing this was not a wound meant to be pressed by a stranger. The visit stretched into the afternoon, and by the time Clara finally rose to leave, she realized she had spent nearly 3 hours in that sunroom without once checking the time, something that rarely happened in her carefully scheduled life. Elena squeezed her hand tightly before she left. "Come back soon," Elena said. "And Clara, be careful. Whatever frightened me that night has not disappeared simply because the police found nothing. I feel it still, sometimes, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. I would not want you caught in it simply because you were kind enough to help an old woman." The warning settled uneasily in Clara's stomach as Vincent walked her out to the car once more. Dominic followed this time, catching up to her just before she reached the vehicle. "My grandmother is right to warn you," he said quietly. "You should consider staying away from this family, Clara, for your own safety." "Is that what you want? For me to stay away?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Clara saw something honest slip through his carefully maintained control, something that surprised them both. "No," he admitted quietly. "But what I want, and what is safe for you, are not always the same thing. I've never been very good at choosing safety over doing what feels right. I'm beginning to understand that about you." They stood there a moment longer, the space between them charged with something neither of them acknowledged aloud, before Clara finally climbed into the car. As it pulled away, she looked back one last time to see Dominic still watching her, his expression torn between wanting her to stay and knowing that keeping her close might mean placing her directly in danger's path. Neither of them yet understood how soon that danger would arrive, or how little choice either of them would have in the matter once it did. 3 days later, Clara received a call from an unknown number while walking home from her shift, the streetlights flickering on above her as evening settled over the city. "Clara Bennett," said an unfamiliar voice, smooth and cold, accented in a way she couldn't quite place. "You've made some very interesting new friends." Clara stopped walking, her pulse quickening. "Who is this?" "Someone who thinks you should be more careful about the company you keep. The Russo family has a way of getting the people around them hurt. I would hate for someone as innocent as you to become another example of that pattern." The line went dead before Clara could respond, leaving her standing alone on the darkening street, the phone trembling slightly in her hand, the warmth of the sunroom and Elena's laughter feeling suddenly very far away. Clara stood frozen on the sidewalk long after the call ended, staring at her phone as though it might ring again and explain itself, offer some context that would make the threat feel less real. It did not ring again. The street around her carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars passing, a couple laughing outside a coffee shop, completely unaware that somewhere close by, someone had just made it clear they were watching her. She thought about calling Dominic immediately, then hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Calling him would mean admitting how frightened she was, and worse, it would mean acknowledging just how deeply she had already become tangled in a world she barely understood. But the alternative, walking home alone with the memory of that cold, smooth voice echoing in her mind, felt far worse. She called Vincent instead, the only number she had been given. He answered on the second ring. "Clara? Someone called me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "They knew my name. They told me to stay away from the Russo family, that people who get close to you end up hurt." There was a brief pause on the line, sharp and heavy. "Where are you right now?" "Walking home from work." "Stay where you are. Do not move. I'm sending a car." "Vincent, it's probably nothing." "Clara," he interrupted, his voice firm in a way she had not heard from him before. "Stay exactly where you are." 15 minutes later, a black car pulled up beside her, and Vincent stepped out, scanning the street with sharp, practiced eyes before guiding her quickly into the back seat. The drive to the mansion was tense and silent, Vincent occasionally glancing into the rearview mirror as though checking for a tail. When they arrived, Dominic was already waiting at the door, and the moment he saw Clara's face, something shifted behind his controlled expression, worry breaking through the careful composure he usually wore like armor. "Tell me exactly what was said," he demanded, leading her inside without wasting a moment on greetings. Clara repeated the call as precisely as she could remember it, watching Dominic's jaw tighten with every word. "Volkov," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's the name your grandmother mentioned," Clara said. "Who exactly are they, Dominic? I think I deserve to know, considering someone just threatened me over the phone." Dominic exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, an unusually human gesture for a man who so rarely allowed himself visible frustration. "Nadia Volkov runs a rival organization that has clashed with my family for over a decade," he explained. "Her father and mine were once partners, until a deal went wrong and blood was spilled on both sides. The hostility has never fully ended. She has been testing our boundaries for months, small provocations, nothing overt enough to justify open conflict. My grandmother's incident on the street may have been one of those tests. And now, apparently, so are you. Why would she care about me? I'm nobody. You're someone my grandmother trusts. Someone I've allowed close to this family. That alone makes you useful to Nadia, whether as leverage or simply as a message that no one connected to us is safe from her reach." The weight of his words settled over Clara like a stone. She had wanted only to help a frightened old woman on the street. She had never imagined that single act of kindness would place her in the crosshairs of a war she knew nothing about. "What do I do now?" "You stay here," Dominic said immediately. "Until we know more. Until we can guarantee your safety. You don't go back to your apartment alone." "I have work, Dominic. I have a life. A life that is currently in danger because of your connection to this family," he said, his voice sharpening with an intensity that startled her. "I won't apologize for wanting to keep you safe, Clara, even if it means you have to be inconvenienced for a while." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, recognizing something beneath his forceful words that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with fear. A fear he clearly was not used to feeling and did not know how to express any other way. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll stay. For now." Something in his shoulders relaxed, just slightly, at her agreement. Elena appeared in the hallway then, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, her expression grim as she took in the scene before her. "She threatened you," Elena said, not a question. "I'll be fine," Clara said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "You will be fine, because we will make certain of it," Elena said firmly, settling into a nearby chair with Vincent's assistance. "I refuse to let that woman touch another person I care about. She took enough from this family already." Something in the way Elena said it caught Clara's attention. "What do you mean, took enough?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Dominic's expression darkened, old pain rising visibly to the surface. "My father," he said finally, his voice low and controlled, though Clara could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "He was killed in this house when I was 17. The official story was a robbery gone wrong. The truth, which took years to uncover, was an assassination ordered by Nadia's father, meant to weaken our family and seize territory while we were vulnerable." Clara's chest tightened with sympathy she had not expected to feel so strongly. "Dominic, I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago," he said, though the tightness in his jaw suggested it did not feel that way to him at all. "But it's why I take threats like the one you received tonight seriously. Nadia grew up watching her father wage war against mine. She has inherited both his ambition and his cruelty, and she has spent years looking for new ways to hurt this family without triggering full retaliation. And now she's looking at me. Now she's looking at you," Dominic confirmed grimly. "Which means I need you close, where I can protect you, until this threat is dealt with completely." That night, Clara was given a guest room in the east wing of the mansion, far larger and more luxurious than anything she had ever slept in before, though sleep proved nearly impossible, with her mind racing through everything she had learned. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the cold voice on the phone, the fear in Elena's eyes, the raw grief that had flickered across Dominic's face when he spoke of his father. A soft knock came at her door sometime past midnight. She opened it to find Dominic standing in the hallway, still dressed, clearly having not slept either. "I couldn't sleep either," he admitted, almost sheepishly, an expression so unlike his usual composure that Clara found herself softening toward him despite everything. "I wanted to make sure you were all right. I'm scared," she admitted honestly. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," he said quietly, "and I wish I could give you the choice to walk away from it entirely, but I would be lying if I said I wanted you to." The honesty in his words hung in the air between them, fragile and unexpected. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and worry etched into his features, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool hallway. "Because in the short time I've known you, you've made this house feel less like a fortress and more like a home," he said quietly. "My grandmother laughs more. Even I find myself thinking of things other than business and danger when you're near. I don't know what to call that yet, but I know I'm not ready to lose it simply because Nadia Volkov has decided to threaten it." Clara's heart raced at his words, at the vulnerability so foreign to the guarded man she had first met on that driveway. "Then let's make sure she doesn't get the chance," Clara said firmly, surprising herself with the resolve in her own voice. A faint, genuine smile touched Dominic's lips, the first she had seen from him since they'd met. "I like this side of you. Fearless, even when you should be terrified." "I'm terrified," she admitted. "I'm just choosing not to let it stop me." "That," Dominic said quietly, "might be the most dangerous thing about you." They stood together in the quiet hallway a moment longer, the threat outside the walls of the mansion feeling, for just a little while, a little further away than it truly was. Glass shattered somewhere on the ground floor, and Clara bolted upright in bed before she even fully understood why, her body reacting to danger before her mind caught up. Shouts echoed through the mansion, followed by the unmistakable sound of running footsteps, heavy and urgent, pounding against marble floors. She threw open her bedroom door just as Vincent rushed past in the hallway, a weapon secured at his hip, his expression carved from pure focus. "Stay in your room," he ordered without slowing. "What's happening?" "Someone breached the east perimeter." "Stay inside. Lock the door. Do not come out until someone comes for you." Clara's heart pounded so violently she could feel it in her throat. She closed the door and locked it as instructed, then pressed her back against the wall, straining to hear anything through the thick wood. More shouting, the distant, muffled sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. And then, terrifyingly, silence. Minutes stretched unbearably. Clara paced the small space of her room, torn between the instruction to stay hidden and the desperate need to know whether Elena, whether Dominic, were safe. Just as she reached for the door handle, a firm knock sounded. "Clara, it's Dominic. Open the door." Relief flooded through her, so intensely her knees nearly buckled. She unlocked the door and pulled it open to find him standing there, a shallow cut along his temple, his shirt slightly torn at the shoulder, but otherwise whole. "You're hurt," she said immediately, reaching for him without thinking. "It's nothing, a graze." He caught her hand gently, holding it for a moment longer than necessary before releasing it. "Nadia's people tried to breach the property tonight. Vincent's team caught them at the east wall before they made it inside. Is everyone all right, Elena?" "She's fine. Frightened, but fine. She's downstairs now, refusing to go back to sleep until she's seen for herself that you're unharmed." Clara followed him down to the main sitting room, where Elena sat wrapped in a thick robe, her hands trembling slightly around a cup of tea that Clara suspected had long since gone cold. The moment she saw Clara, relief washed visibly over her weathered face. "Thank goodness," Elena breathed, reaching out to squeeze Clara's hand tightly. "I feared the worst when I heard the alarms." "I'm okay," Clara reassured her, sitting close beside the older woman. "We're all okay." "This time," Dominic said grimly from across the room, his tone leaving no room for false comfort. "Nadia grows bolder. A perimeter breach is no longer a subtle threat over the phone. This was an attempt to send a message directly into our home." "What message?" Clara asked. "That she can reach us whenever she chooses," Dominic said. "That our security means nothing to her if she decides to act." Vincent entered the room then, his expression grave, holding a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal a folded note, sealed with a symbol Clara didn't recognize, a wolf's head carved into dark wax. "Left at the breach point," Vincent said, handing it to Dominic. "Meant to be found." Dominic unfolded the note, his expression darkening further as he read the contents silently before passing it to Elena, who read it with a sharp intake of breath. "What does it say?" Clara asked, unable to bear the tension any longer. Dominic's eyes met hers, heavy with a weight she didn't yet understand. "It says that Nadia knows about you, that she considers you a weakness in this family's armor, and that unless we distance ourselves from you entirely and publicly, she will consider you a legitimate target, the same as anyone bearing the Russo name." The words settled over Clara like ice water, the reality of the danger she had stumbled into finally crystallizing with brutal clarity. This was no longer an abstract threat delivered over a phone call. This was a woman with the resources and ruthlessness to breach a fortified mansion, willing to draw an innocent stranger into a decades-old war simply to prove a point. "Then maybe she's right," Clara said quietly, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. "Maybe I should distance myself. Maybe that's the only way to keep everyone safe." "No," Dominic said immediately, sharply, surprising even himself with the force of his refusal. "I won't let her dictate who I choose to protect. I won't let her win simply by making a threat." "Dominic, this isn't about pride. If my presence here puts you and Elena in more danger." "It's not about pride," he interrupted, crossing the room to stand directly before her, his eyes intense and unwavering. "It's about refusing to let fear control every decision this family makes. I lost my father to that kind of thinking, to hesitation and caution that cost him his life anyway in the end. I won't repeat that mistake by pushing away someone who matters to me simply because Nadia Volkov has decided to threaten it. Someone who matters to me." The words hung in the air between them, unmistakable in their meaning, and Clara felt her chest tighten with an emotion far too complicated to untangle in a moment, as fraught as this one. Elena watched the exchange with knowing, tired eyes, a faint, sad smile touching her lips despite the tension in the room. "He is right, Clara, though I understand your fear. Running from Nadia has never once stopped her from causing harm. It has only ever emboldened her further." "So what do we do?" Clara asked, looking between grandmother and grandson. "We find out what she truly wants," Dominic said, his voice steadying with renewed resolve. "And we make certain she understands, in terms she cannot misinterpret, that this family does not bend simply because she has grown bold enough to test our walls." Vincent cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, there is something else. Our contact within Volkov's organization sent word an hour before the breach. Nadia has called for a meeting. She wishes to speak with you directly, tomorrow evening, at neutral ground." Dominic's expression sharpened with suspicion. "A meeting after tonight's attack? That's either an act of extraordinary confidence or a trap." "Possibly both," Vincent said grimly. "I'm coming," Clara said suddenly, the words leaving her mouth before she had fully decided to speak them. Every head in the room turned toward her in surprise. "Absolutely not," Dominic said immediately. "She's threatening me, Dominic. If this is about me, then I have every right to be part of the conversation that decides my fate." "It's far too dangerous. Everything about the last week has been dangerous," Clara interrupted, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. "I've been threatened over the phone. I've hidden in a locked room while your home was attacked, and now you want to negotiate with the woman responsible without me even present. I'm done being a bystander in my own crisis." Silence fell over the room as Dominic studied her, something complicated passing behind his dark eyes, frustration warring visibly with something that looked remarkably like admiration. "She has the same fire your father had," Elena murmured quietly, watching them both with quiet amusement despite the gravity of the situation. "Perhaps it is time you stopped trying to shield everyone from danger and started trusting them to stand beside you instead." Dominic exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally easing, though the worry in his eyes remained. "Fine," he said finally, his voice low. "You come, but you stay close to me the entire time, and if I tell you to leave, you leave immediately. No arguments." "Agreed," Clara said, relief and fear tangled together in her chest in equal measure. As the room began to settle, plans forming quietly around the coming meeting, Clara found herself standing near the tall windows, staring out at the dark grounds where, only hours before, danger had come uninvited to this family's door. She thought of the frightened old woman she had helped on a crowded street, of the cold voice on the phone, of the man across the room who had just declared, in his own quiet way, that he refused to let her go. Whatever tomorrow's meeting brought, she understood now that there was no walking away from this. She had stepped into the Russo family's world with a single act of kindness, and now, whether through fate or choice, she belonged to it completely. The meeting place was an old restaurant on the edge of the city, closed for the evening and emptied of staff except for two men who stood guard near the kitchen entrance, their presence quiet but unmistakably armed. Clara sat beside Dominic in the back seat of the car as it approached, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Remember what we discussed," Dominic said quietly, his eyes fixed on the restaurant ahead. "You say nothing unless I indicate it's safe to speak. You stay beside me at all times. If anything feels wrong, you leave through the side entrance. Vincent will be watching. I remember." He glanced at her, something softening briefly in his expression, despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "You didn't have to come tonight." "Yes, I did," Clara said simply. "This is my life. She's threatening too." The car stopped, and Vincent opened the door, scanning the street with sharp, wary eyes before allowing them to step out. Inside, the restaurant was dim, most of the lights extinguished except for a single table near the back, illuminated by a low-hanging lamp. A woman sat waiting there, elegant and composed, her dark hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been beautiful if not for the coldness carved so deeply into it. Nadia Volkov rose slightly as they approached, her lips curving into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Dominic," she greeted smoothly, "so good of you to come. And you brought her." Her gaze slid to Clara, sharp and assessing, lingering with open curiosity. "The waitress who has caused so much trouble." I work at a diner, Clara said before she could stop herself. Not that it matters to you. Nadia's smile widened slightly, something almost like amusement flickering in her cold eyes. She has spirit. I can see why Elena adores her so. Say what you came to say, Nadia, Dominic said, his voice carrying none of the warmth he'd shown in private, only cold, controlled authority. You attacked my home last night. You threatened someone under my protection. I want to know why. Nadia gestured toward the empty chairs across from her, waiting until they were seated before speaking again, her movements unhurried, deliberate, the movements of a woman who enjoyed holding power over a room. For years, she began, our families have circled each other, testing boundaries, careful never to cross a line that would force open conflict. I grew tired of the careful dance. I wanted to see how far I could push before you finally reacted with something other than restraint. And now you've seen it, Dominic said flatly. What exactly did you learn? That you're distracted, Nadia said, her eyes flicking pointedly toward Clara. That the great Dominic Rousseau, who has spent a decade building a reputation for cold, calculated control, has developed a weakness. A pretty, ordinary girl who makes him careless in ways his enemies can exploit. She's not a weakness, Dominic said, his voice hardening. Isn't she? Nadia's smile turned sharp. You brought her to a meeting with someone who has already proven willing to breach your home and threaten her life directly. That is not the decision of a careful man, Dominic. That is the decision of a man who has let his heart override his judgment, exactly as your father once did. The mention of his father visibly struck a nerve, Dominic's jaw tightening, his hands curling slightly against the tabletop. Do not speak of my father, he said, his voice dangerously low. Why not? Nadia leaned forward, something almost hungry in her expression now. He made the same mistake, trusting too easily, allowing sentiment to cloud decisions that should have been made with cold clarity. It cost him everything. I wonder if history intends to repeat itself. Is that a threat? Clara asked, unable to remain silent any longer despite her promise to Dominic. Nadia's gaze shifted to her, cold and assessing. It is an observation, dear girl. Whether it becomes a threat depends entirely on what Dominic decides to do next. What do you want, Nadia? Dominic demanded, cutting through the tension with barely controlled fury. You didn't call this meeting simply to deliver veiled threats and reminisce about old wounds. What is it you actually want? Nadia sat back slowly, studying him for a long, calculating moment before finally speaking. Territory. The docks along the eastern shore, currently under your family's control, have become valuable to my operations. I want them ceded, quietly, without conflict. In exchange, I will consider the matter of your grandmother's incident and your waitress's continued safety resolved. You're asking me to hand over territory my family has controlled for 3 generations, in exchange for you simply agreeing to stop threatening people you have no right to threaten in the first place, Dominic said, his voice flat with disbelief. I'm offering you peace, Nadia corrected smoothly. Something your father never had the wisdom to accept when it was offered to him. The reference to his father's death hung heavy and deliberate in the air, and Clara watched something shift behind Dominic's eyes, old grief and fresh anger colliding in a way that made her chest ache with sympathy, despite the danger of the moment. I will consider your offer, Dominic said finally, his voice carefully controlled once more. But understand this, Nadia. If you, or anyone connected to you, comes near Clara again, territory will be the least of your concerns. I will not show the restraint my father showed. I will not make the same mistakes. Nadia studied him for a long moment, something almost respectful flickering behind her cold expression. We shall see, Dominic. We shall see whether you have truly become the man your father never managed to be, or whether history is simply preparing to repeat itself in a different shade. She rose gracefully, gathering her coat from the back of her chair, pausing once more to look at Clara with an expression that was difficult to read, something between curiosity and pity. Be careful, little waitress, Nadia said quietly. Loving a Russo has never once ended well for anyone who wasn't born into this world already. I would hate to watch you learn that lesson the way so many others already have. She left without another word, her guards falling into step behind her, leaving Clara and Dominic alone in the dim, empty restaurant, the weight of everything that had just been said settling heavily between them. "She's wrong," Dominic said quietly, after a long silence, though his voice carried more uncertainty than Clara had heard from him before. "I won't let this end the way it did for my father." "How do you know that?" Clara asked softly. "How can you be certain?" Dominic turned to look at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression, stripped bare of the composure he wore so carefully in front of everyone else. "Because unlike him, I know exactly what I'm risking, and exactly what I refuse to lose. I won't make the mistake of thinking restraint alone will protect the people I care about. I intend to fight for what matters, not simply hope it survives on its own." The intensity in his words left Clara breathless, the danger of the evening momentarily forgotten in the weight of what he was clearly, carefully trying to say without saying it outright. "Dominic," she said softly, "what exactly am I to you?" He reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his thumb tracing slowly across her knuckles in a gesture far more tender than anything she had seen from him before. "Someone I never expected to find," he said quietly. "Someone who walked into a war she knew nothing about simply because she couldn't stand to watch another person suffer. Someone I am not willing to let Nadia Volkov, or anyone else, take away from me." Outside, the city continued on, unaware of the quiet, dangerous promise being made inside the dim restaurant, unaware that a war decades in the making had just found a new and unexpected center around which to turn. Gunfire erupted somewhere near the front gate, tearing Clara from sleep so violently that she was on her feet before she fully understood what had woken her. The mansion's alarm blared through the halls, red emergency lights pulsing against the walls, and for one terrifying moment she simply stood frozen in the darkness of her room, her mind refusing to process the sound of what could only be a full assault on the property. Her door burst open before she could reach it herself, and Vincent appeared, his face grim, a weapon already drawn. "Nadia's people," he said tightly. "A full team, not a probe like last time. Move, now." He guided her quickly through the hallway, away from the windows, down a narrow staircase Clara had never noticed before, hidden behind a section of wall paneling near the library. The sound of chaos grew louder as they descended, shouting, the sharp crack of gunfire, glass shattering somewhere above them. "Where's Dominic? Where's Elena?" "Elena is already secured in the safe room below," Vincent said, pushing open a reinforced door at the bottom of the stairs. "Dominic is coordinating the defense. He'll join us once the perimeter is secure." Inside the hidden room, Elena sat wrapped in a blanket, her face pale but composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She reached for Clara the moment she entered, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Thank God," Elena whispered. "I feared she would come for you first." "What's happening up there?" Clara asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain calm. "Nadia has grown tired of negotiation," Elena said grimly. "This is no longer a warning. This is an attempt to end things permanently, one way or another." The sounds of battle continued above them, muffled but unmistakable through the reinforced walls, and Clara found herself pacing the small room, every gunshot sending fresh terror spiking through her chest at the thought of Dominic somewhere in the middle of it. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, though Clara knew it could only have been a fraction of that time. Finally, the door opened, and Vincent appeared again, blood staining his sleeve, though his expression suggested the wound was minor. "Perimeter is secure," he reported. "We caught them by surprise with our own defenses. Casualties on their side, none of ours beyond minor injuries." "And Dominic?" Clara asked immediately, unable to keep the desperation from her voice. "He's fine. He's asking for you both upstairs." Relief flooded through Clara so intensely, her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She followed Vincent back up through the mansion, Elena moving more slowly behind them, until they emerged into the main hall, where Dominic stood surveying the damage, a shallow cut along his forearm, his shirt torn, but his expression fierce with barely contained fury. The moment he saw Clara, something in his posture eased, though the tension in his jaw remained. "You're safe," he said, closing the distance between them and pulling her into an embrace so tight it stole the breath from her lungs. "I was terrified something had happened before Vincent got you below." "I'm fine. We're both fine." Clara pulled back slightly to look at him, taking in the exhaustion and fury warring behind his dark eyes. "This has to end, Dominic. People could have died tonight." "It ends now," he said grimly, releasing her to turn toward Vincent. "Where is she? Where is Nadia?" "Our people traced the attack to a warehouse on the eastern docks," Vincent reported. "She's coordinating from there personally. Confident or arrogant enough to believe we wouldn't dare strike back at her directly. Then she's about to learn how wrong that assumption was," Dominic said, his voice carrying a cold, controlled fury that sent a chill down Clara's spine. "Dominic," Elena said sharply, stepping forward despite her exhaustion, "think carefully before you act. If you go after her directly, this becomes exactly the kind of war that killed your father. Reckless, uncontrolled, impossible to end cleanly. She just tried to kill everyone in this house. Grandmother, I won't sit here and wait for her to try again." "Then don't act alone," Clara said suddenly, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. "Don't let anger make the decision for you. Think it through. If she's confident enough to attack directly, maybe that overconfidence is exactly what you need to use against her." Dominic turned to look at her, something calculating slowly replacing the raw fury in his expression as her words settled over him. "Explain," he said quietly. "You said she's coordinating from the warehouse personally, confident you wouldn't dare strike back," Clara continued, her mind racing now that the initial terror had begun to fade into something sharper, more focused. "What if you let her believe that confidence is justified right up until it isn't? Draw her out with the illusion of retreat, then close in when she least expects resistance." Vincent's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of surprised approval crossing his usually neutral expression. "It has merit, sir. A controlled approach, rather than a direct assault that plays into exactly the reckless narrative she's trying to provoke." Dominic studied Clara for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes, respect and something warmer still tangled together. "You continue to surprise me," he said quietly. "I've had a crash course in surviving Mafia politics this past week," Clara said, a faint, exhausted smile touching her lips despite everything. "I'm learning fast." Within the hour, a plan had been formed, careful and calculated, rather than the reckless retaliation Dominic's fury had initially demanded. Vincent's people would approach the warehouse under the guise of retreat, drawing Nadia's forces into overconfidence, while a second team moved quietly to secure the perimeter and cut off any possibility of escape. Clara insisted on being present at the command center Dominic established in the mansion's study, unwilling to sit idle while the outcome of everything hung in the balance. Elena joined her there as well, the two women sitting together in tense silence as reports filtered in through Vincent's radio, each update tightening the knot of anxiety in Clara's chest. "He gets this focus from his father," Elena said quietly, watching the tension play across the room as Dominic listened intently to each incoming report. "That same ability to set fear aside entirely once a decision has been made. It served his father well, right up until the moment it didn't. He'll be careful," Clara said, though she wasn't certain whether she was reassuring Elena or herself. "He has more reason than ever to be careful now." Elena reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "Yes, I believe he does." The radio crackled to life, Vincent's voice tense but controlled. "Perimeter secured. Nadia's people are pulling back, believing our forces have retreated as planned. We're moving in now." The minutes that followed stretched unbearably, each second dragging with an agony Clara had never before experienced. her mind conjuring every possible disaster while she waited for word of what was happening at the warehouse. Elena's grip on her hand tightened with each passing moment, both women united in silent, desperate hope. Finally, the radio crackled again. "Warehouse secured. Nadia Volkov is in custody. No casualties on our side." The relief that flooded through Clara was so overwhelming she nearly wept, her entire body sagging with the release of tension she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. Elena let out a shaky breath beside her, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. "Thank God," Elena whispered. It was nearly dawn by the time Dominic returned to the mansion, exhaustion evident in every line of his body, though something had eased in his expression as well. A weight lifted that Clara suspected had been pressing on him far longer than just this single night. "It's over," he said quietly, finding Clara still waiting in the study, Elena having finally succumbed to exhausted sleep in a nearby chair. "Nadia has been secured. Her organization is already fracturing without her direct leadership. It will take time to fully resolve, negotiations, boundaries redrawn, but the immediate threat has ended." "And you?" Clara asked softly, studying the exhaustion etched into his features. "Are you all right?" "I am now," he said, crossing the room to stand before her, reaching out to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch far gentler than the fierce authority he'd carried into battle only hours before. "Your idea worked. Without your suggestion, I would have walked directly into whatever trap her overconfidence was hiding. You may have saved every life in this house tonight, including my own." "I just didn't want to lose anyone," Clara said quietly. "Any of you." Something shifted in Dominic's expression, soft and unguarded in a way she had only glimpsed in fleeting moments before. "Clara, these past weeks, everything that has happened, the danger, the fear, none of it has changed how I feel. If anything, it has only made it clearer." "Made what clearer?" "That I don't want a life without you in it," he said quietly, his voice raw with an honesty that stole the breath from her lungs. "Whatever comes next, whatever rebuilding this family requires after tonight, I want you beside me through all of it. Not because you're in danger, and not out of obligation, but because somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, you became the one steady thing I could not imagine losing." Tears filled Clara's eyes, exhaustion and relief, and something far deeper tangled together as she reached up to cup his face gently in her hands. "I don't want a life without you either," she whispered. "I didn't expect any of this when I stopped to help Elena that night, but I wouldn't trade it, not even the danger, not even the fear, because it led me here." Dominic leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, though she did not. And when their lips finally met, it felt less like a beginning and more like an inevitability, something that had been building quietly beneath the surface of every stolen glance and careful conversation since that very first night on the driveway. Outside, the first light of dawn began creeping over the horizon, gentle and golden, chasing away the last shadows of a night that had nearly cost them everything, and promising, in its own quiet way, that whatever came next, they would face it together. 6 months later, the sunroom at the back of the Russo mansion looked nothing like the tense, uncertain place Clara remembered from her first visit. Sunlight poured through the wide windows, warming the rows of blooming flowers Elena tended each morning, with steady, practiced hands. Her strength returned in full now that the shadow of fear no longer followed her through every quiet moment of her day. Clara knelt beside her, helping to trim back a cluster of overgrown roses, laughing softly at something Elena had said, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it had never quite been during those first frightening weeks. "You've gotten better at this," Elena observed, nodding approvingly at Clara's careful pruning. "A few months ago, you would have cut the wrong stem entirely." "I had a good teacher," Clara said, smiling. Nadia Volkov's organization had fractured completely in the months following her capture, her most loyal lieutenants, scattering or aligning themselves with other powers across the city, leaving no coherent force behind to continue the old rivalry that had haunted the Russo family for so long. Dominic had handled the aftermath with a careful, measured hand, refusing to let victory curdle into the same kind of ruthless expansion that had defined the conflict for decades before him. Where his father might have sought to conquer the vacuum Nadia left behind, Dominic instead worked quietly to establish boundaries, alliances built on mutual respect rather than fear, determined to build something steadier than the world he had inherited. Clara had moved into the mansion officially just 2 months earlier, though it had taken her far longer than that to stop feeling like a guest within its grand walls. Slowly, the house had become something warmer, something that finally deserved to be called a home rather than simply a fortress. She still worked occasional shifts at the diner, refusing to give up the small, steady piece of her old life entirely, though Dominic had long since stopped protesting the arrangement, understanding now that her independence was as much a part of who she was as the courage that had first drawn him to her. Footsteps approached from the hallway, and Clara looked up to see Dominic entering the sunroom, dressed casually for once, a rare softness in his expression that had become far more common in the months since Nadia's defeat. "There you two are," he said, crossing the room to press a gentle kiss to Clara's temple before settling into the chair beside his grandmother. "I've been looking everywhere." "We were just discussing how much Clara has improved with the roses," Elena said, her eyes bright with quiet contentment. "Though I still say she has a heavy hand with the shears." "I heard that," Clara said, laughing. Dominic watched them both with an expression Clara had come to recognize easily now. Something warm and unguarded, so different from the cold, suspicious man who had first confronted her on the driveway all those months ago. The weight he had carried since his father's death seemed lighter now, not gone entirely. Grief like that never truly disappeared, but softened, made bearable by the family that had finally, fully healed around him. "I have news," Dominic said, glancing between them. "The negotiations with the Eastern Territories concluded this morning. Peacefully, for once, without threats or bloodshed required." "That's wonderful," Clara said, genuine pride swelling in her chest at how far he had come, at the kind of leader he had chosen to become, despite everything the world had tried to make of him. "It is," Elena agreed, reaching over to pat her grandson's hand affectionately. "Your father would be proud, Dominic, not simply of the empire you protect, but of the man you have become while protecting it." Something flickered across Dominic's face at the mention of his father. Old grief mixed now with something calmer, more accepting than it had ever been before. "I used to believe strength meant becoming untouchable," he said quietly, looking toward Clara with an expression full of quiet gratitude. "Cold, controlled, incapable of being hurt because I refused to let anyone close enough to hurt me. It took nearly losing everything to understand that real strength meant something entirely different." "What's that?" Clara asked softly, though she already suspected the answer. "Choosing to stay open, even after everything that taught me to close myself off," he said. "Choosing to build something worth protecting, rather than simply protecting what already exists out of fear of losing it." Elena smiled warmly, rising slowly from her chair with the aid of her cane, though her steps carried far more strength now than they had on that terrifying night so many months ago. "I believe that is my cue to leave you two alone for a while. An old woman needs her afternoon rest, and you clearly have things to discuss that require considerably less gardening advice than I have to offer." She pressed a gentle kiss to each of their heads before making her way slowly out of the sunroom, leaving Clara and Dominic alone amid the fragrant blooms and warm afternoon light. Dominic reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together with the easy familiarity of two people who had weathered far more together than most couples ever faced in a lifetime. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly, stopping that night. "Getting pulled into all of this." Clara considered the question seriously, thinking back to the fear of those early weeks, the threats, the danger, the sleepless nights spent wondering whether she had made a terrible mistake by refusing to walk away when she still had the chance. "Never," she said finally, and meant it completely. "I found more than I ever expected that night. Not just you, though that alone would have been enough. I found a family, a purpose, a version of myself I don't think I ever would have discovered if I had simply kept walking past a frightened old woman on the street." Dominic lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles, his eyes holding hers with a warmth that still, even after everything, managed to steal her breath. "I used to think love was a weakness," he admitted quietly. "Something that had cost my father everything, something I swore I would never allow myself to feel so completely. You proved me wrong in every possible way." "Good," Clara said, smiling as she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder while the afternoon sun warmed the room around them. "Because I have no intention of letting you go back to being that guarded, suspicious man who nearly refused to thank me on the driveway." Dominic laughed, a rare, unguarded sound that Clara had grown to treasure more than almost anything else in this new life she had built, and wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as the roses bloomed quietly around them, and the danger that had once threatened everything finally, fully faded into nothing more than a story they would one day tell together, a beginning disguised, at the time, as nothing more than an ordinary act of kindness on a crowded, unremarkable street.